welcome to today's webinar. I can see a few more people are still joining us, but in the interest of time, I'd like to start. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Today's webinar is on effective implementation of socio-economic rights at the national level, today being 26th of January 2021 at 2 p.m. South African time. By way of introduction, effective implementation of socio-economic rights not only requires the recognition of these rights and effective implementation of socio-economic rights not only requires the recognition of these rights as justiciable and enforceable rights, it requires the development and implementation of policies to give effect to them at the national level. It also necessitates ratification, domestication, implementation, tracking, and reporting on progress made on measures taken to comply with international norms and standards. South Africa's initial state report to the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights highlighted on some of the measures undertaken in the implementation of the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. The committee issued concluding observations and recommendations to South Africa on 12th October 2018. These concluding observations have a direct impact on issues at the center of public debate about the need to accelerate economic transformation, expedite wealth redistribution, and eliminate inequality in South Africa. They provide an opportunity for the government to re-evaluate its progress in fulfilling the constitutional promise of socio-economic rights. This webinar today seeks to answer some of these questions, namely, to what extent has South African government implemented the concluding observations in light of COVID-19 pandemic? Secondly, what opportunities exist to engage with the government in a view to implement the concluding observation? And thirdly, are there lessons that can be drawn from other jurisdictions such as Canada in ensuring effective implementation of socio-economic rights at the national level? To help us find answers to these questions, we have 4 panelists. And I'll allow each panelist to introduce themselves, but namely Professor Sandy Liebenberg, Yuri Ramkisson from South Africa Human Rights Commission, Professor Sandy Liebenberg from Stellenbosch University, and she was also a member of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, Lynette Mars, National Director at Black Sash, and Bruce Porter, Executive Director at the Social Rights Advocacy Center, Canada. I am your moderator, Gladys Mirugi Mukundi. I'm a researcher at the Socio-Economic Rights Project, Dola Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape. This is the first in a series of webinars we intend to host as part of a group of civil society organizations on the campaign on economic, social, cultural rights. In terms of housekeeping rules, just to flag a few to the participants, kindly mute your speaker while the presenters are talking. Only use your speaker during the discussion session. Secondly, kindly use the chat function to write your questions to the panelists. Kindly keep the questions short and precise. And thirdly, to save bandwidth, all participants have been requested to put off their cameras. We'll only have the respective panelists, we'll only see the respective panelists speaking. And to the panelists, each of you have about 10 to 15 minutes to make presentation. You can make it verbally or on PowerPoint. And thereafter, there will be a discussion session where you can interact with the participants. I welcome all of you and I thank you all for making time to be here with us today. So I'll call upon our first speaker, Professor Liebenberg. Welcome.
So hi everyone, and hi to Gladys and all the participants. I hope you can all hear me clearly. It's a great honor to be part of this webinar at a very critical moment in South Africa as we face the ravages at so many levels of the COVID pandemic. And I see my role in this webinar basically as a scene setting webinar to look at the economic and social rights obligations of South Africa, the concluding observations that Gladys mentioned under the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. What are some of the follow-up mechanisms of this body? And then also what I see to be some of the key priority challenges that are faced by South Africa in the implementation of economic, social, and cultural rights. So I've prepared a few slides and I'm going to try and share my screen so that I can speak to the slides. If you just give me 1 second. Right. Let me try again. I'm a little bit, let me just open my slides, sorry. Can everyone see my slides? Gladys, can you see the slides?
No, the slide is not visible. It appeared, then disappeared.
And now?
Yes, now it's visible. We can see it.
Great.
Please go ahead.
Thanks, Gladys. Okay, so just to broadly recap, I mean, there are 4 main sources of legal obligations on South Africa regarding economic, social, and cultural rights. Of course, primarily for us would be the Bill of Rights in the 1996 Constitution and the legislation which has been adopted to give effect to the Bill of Rights. Then you have the regional African system, including the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Children's Charter on Rights and Welfare of the Child, and the Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa. Then you have the document which Gladys was speaking to, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And you have other treaties at regional and national level focusing on specific groups and non-discrimination. For example, the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, racial discrimination, rights of people with disabilities, and so forth. Now, just in the interest of time, I will just focus on a combination of the South African Constitution and the ISESCA, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. But I think this is an integrated system and many of the principles are similar and mutually reinforcing. So just to cap on the key principles that international law and to some extent also the South African Constitution recognize with regard to economic, social and cultural rights. So the ISESCA recognizes the concept of minimum core obligations, that there should be a floor of essential levels of provision for people whose needs are urgent and who are disadvantaged and vulnerable. Although the South African Constitutional Court has not recognized per se a doctrine of minimum core obligations, it has said that there needs to be prioritization of those who are most in need. And this has been a principle in a number of cases, such as the Grootboom case, TAC, etc. From the floor of minimum core obligations, the ISESCA requires the progressive realization of the rights to the ceiling, if you like, of the full realization of the relevant rights. For example, the right to an adequate standard of living, adequate housing, etc. And essentially, progressive realization does not mean that the state can infinitely postpone taking steps. In fact, it imposes a duty on states to show that they are making reasonable, measurable, and participatory progress towards the realization of the rights. So they've got to be able to show expeditious progress towards full realization. The concept of progressive realization also implies that there shouldn't be any backward measures, that in principle, measures that reduce current levels of progress are inconsistent with international law and can only be justified according to certain very strict criteria. For example, the state must show that there's a crisis, a genuine crisis that makes the retrogression necessary. They must show that it is temporary, that it goes no further than is strictly needed to deal with the crisis. And the most disadvantaged shouldn't bear the disproportionate burden, so there should not be any direct or indirect discrimination. And there is this floor of minimum core obligations beneath which retrogressive measures may not go. Also, a principle of international law is that of the maximum available resources. Again, many states and many commentators incorrectly assume that this is a get out of jail free card, if you like, because the state can always plead lack of available resources. However, the interpretation by the committee is that it imposes a positive duty on the state to mobilize the maximum of available resources to realize economic, social, and cultural rights through tax measures, through, if needed, international assistance and cooperation, through redistributive measures, and I'll come to say more about that in a little while. Non-discrimination and substantive equality, that not only is the state obliged to refrain from discrimination, but it must also take positive measures to redress and overcome such inequalities. It must also protect against private sector violations by establishing legislation and policy to prevent private violations of human rights. International assistance and cooperation is one of the key principles of the covenant, recognizing that many challenges, and we've seen this most vividly with COVID and with climate change, are global challenges which cannot be basically combated only by national efforts. They require a joint international effort. And then, as fundamental human rights, there are certain cross-cutting norms which apply of human dignity, participation, access to effective remedies, and the interdependence between economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights, including, the right to protest, the right to basically freedom of assembly, and so forth. So those are the key principles. Now, Gladys mentioned in her opening remarks the concluding observations on South Africa, which were delivered by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which monitors state obligations under the Covenant in November 2018. And they're quite interesting because of the detailed attention which these concluding observations give to issues of the mobilization of maximum available resources in South Africa. And clearly the committee was very concerned that not only is South Africa failing to exploit the redistributive potential of its fiscal policy towards a more inclusive development pathway, but in fact that it is also retrogressing on certain aspects of social rights, this concept of retrogression I explained earlier. And it is a whole paragraph dedicated to austerity measures. So effectively that many of the budgets have not kept pace with population growth, with inflation, that they are being eroded, and that the committee then made a series of recommendations of South Africa to enhance both human rights-based impact of budgetary processes, parliamentary oversight of implementation of budgetary processes, and also increased levels of social spending. I'm not going to go into this in detail because of time constraints, and there's a lot of concluding observations. The Dalla Omar Institute has done a very useful summation. But to mention that the recommendations also covered employment, they covered critically for our current context. I mean, obviously these COBS concluding observations were prior to the COVID outbreak. But on Social Security, for example, the recommendation that South Africa actually set a benchmark for a composite index on cost of living to benchmark social grants and benefit programs, the idea that they would raise social grants to the level where they could secure an adequate standard of living, the gaping chasm in social security for those between the cutoff age of the child support grant and the kicking in of the old age pension, and importantly, considering the introduction of a basic income grant. So I'll just focus on those for now. I mean, my slides deal with some of the others, but I realize time is against us. And just to note that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has a new mechanism in the last 2 years to follow up on certain recommendations, and these are recommendations which it deems urgent, it's up to 3, and attainable within a 24-month period. And the 3 urgent issues that it has selected for follow-up is this one I mentioned on the composite index on the cost of living, the access to social assistance of adults between 18 and 59 years old, the adoption of the Social Assistance Amendment Bill to increase the level of the CSG for children living with orphaned and abandoned children living with relatives, and migrant non-national children having access to education regardless of their immigration status. Now, South Africa, the follow-up mechanism means that South Africa has to, within 24 months, file a report with the UN committee, and this report was due on the 29th November 2020. It also makes provision for parallel reports by civil society organizations and national human rights institutions. And ultimately, the committee will assess whether or not there has been sufficient progress, insufficient progress, lack of sufficient information to make an assessment, or no response. Now, I'm sure some of the other panelists will also address this, but in fact, a number of states, I understand, wrote to the committee to request extensions of their follow-up reports during the COVID period. Because I was a member of the committee last year and also the follow-up rapporteur, I was excluded from being involved as a South African with anything to do with South Africa's follow-up. So I can't speak in detail what has happened, but as mentioned, I think a number of countries have requested extensions to these follow-up reports. Now, you may say to me, okay, well, this is all very good and well, happening at the international level, these broad norms, but what do they actually mean on the ground? And what is their legal and enforceable status in South Africa? So the first point to note is that these are recommendations. They are not per se legally binding standards that one can directly enforce in court, but nonetheless, they are the authoritative assessment by a high-level cross-country international panel on the assessment of South Africa's compliance with its obligations under the covenant. And as such, in line with South Africa's obligation to cooperate in good faith with the treaty monitoring bodies, it should really undertake serious and good faith consideration of these recommendations, and it should be able to explain to Parliament and the public how it is treating these recommendations, all of them, not just the urgent ones. It's important to note also that there is this sort of porous boundaries between international law and domestic law. So many of these international obligations can also get teeth through being taken up and accepted into South African court judgments or legislation. So just two recent examples are in the Mshlangu case handed down by the Constitutional Court late last year. Essentially, the Constitutional Court referred inter alia to the recommendation that domestic workers be included in the scheme for occupational injuries and diseases in support of its finding that the Constitution obliged this inclusion of domestic workers. Also importantly, this doctrine of retrogressive measures that I spoke to, which has been recognized both by SESC and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. The North Gauteng High Court referred to this doctrine and relied on it in finding that the failure to roll out the National School Nutrition Program last year to children who were not yet back in school after the closure of schools was lifted, and they didn't get their daily meal while they were sitting at home, that violated the right of children to basic education, because without nutrition, if you're hungry, you can't learn, as well as to basic nutrition in the Constitution. So international law can basically acquire force through being taken up, being used to interpret our own Bill of Rights. Now, in the last few minutes remaining to me, I just want to touch on what are some of the implications in the specific context of COVID. As I don't need to tell this audience that COVID has tipped us from an already dire poverty and inequality situation into a crisis situation of unemployment, hunger, insecurity, violence, and ever-deepening spirals of race, gender, and wealth inequalities. There's effectively been a jobs bloodbath, which predictably has impacted most severely on women, on Black persons, on the youth, on people in the informal sector and precarious workers. So that by the third quarter of last year, on the far more accurate expanded definition of employment, we are looking at a staggering unemployment rate of 43%. Hunger is definitely a major problem, and without the additional package of support measures, the NITS-CRAM research estimates that 9.8 million South Africans face hunger. The additional support package rescues almost 6 million people from hunger, so but still leaving 4 million. And now we face a situation where in October last year, the caretakers grants, the top up of the social grants came to an end. The TERS scheme came to an end, although it might be extended. And we have the 350 Rand COVID relief grant, which is due to come to an end at the end of this month, although there are hopeful noises from President Ramaphosa's remarks to the ANC Lekgotla on possibly extending it. Also, the disparate impact of South Africa's dual-track healthcare system and social determinants on health, on Black people and women, stats on their increased burden of disease and increased school dropouts in South Africa from already a very high base, particularly with the shift to online schooling. So in conclusion, what I would see as three priorities that seem to me to be important for implementing ESC rights during the current pandemic is that at the very least, there should be maintenance and increased levels of the social protection floor that we've spoken about. So certainly the COVID grant for the unemployed should be extended and at least increased to some sort of level of the food poverty line. Many women are desperately affected by the stopping of the caregiver grants. So this I see as really important, along with other forms of social protection in place, such as the TERS scheme and other mechanisms of relief, food distribution, etc. Obviously, vaccine access and distribution has been very much in the media and is going to be an absolutely critical issue to any sort of return to normality. In November, at its last session, my last session on CESC, the CESC adopted a statement on the question of vaccine access, and it both focused on the domestic duty to ensure transparent and participatory strategy for acquiring, prioritizing, and distributing the vaccine, but also this principle of international assistance and cooperation. The issue of vaccine nationalism, where richer countries are making bilateral deals with the makers of the vaccines and getting many times their population size in doses, while poorer countries, including in Africa, many are, such as South Africa, are still waiting to vaccinate, and also the important principle that intellectual property rights should not be a barrier to this critical public good of accessing the vaccine. So it addresses the question of TRIPS flexibilities for public health measures under the trade and related aspects part of the intellectual property regime, and also refers with approval to initiatives. It doesn't mention South Africa and India by name, but it's obvious it's referring to this initiative to get the WTO to waive patent protections on treatments, diagnostics, and vaccines for COVID. And then an issue that many are working on, and the Budget Justice Coalition and many others, that there should be adequate budgetary provision for socio-economic rights in the short, medium, and long term. So last year, and in fact, not just last year, in fact, there's been a long history of fiscal consolidation measures, which led the committee to actually flag the issue of austerity policies. But this has become really urgent in the pandemic and also in the light of the supplementary budget of June last year and the October medium-term budgetary policy statement, where Treasury committed to a policy of fiscal consolidation and to reduce non-interest expenditure on the main budget by 300 billion rand over the next 3 years. And this is going to have a massive impact on socio-economic rights in areas such as basic infrastructure, in basic education, higher education and training, human settlements, land reform, and even in institutions such as the National Prosecuting Authority, who are essential for combating corruption, SARS, the tax authority, and so forth. So I think, civil society really does need to talk about counter strategies. Can the committee's doctrine of non-retrogression be mobilized to push back against these fiscal consolidation mechanisms? And if so, how can this be done? And also to look very closely, we already have a loan of some 70 billion from the IMF. What are the conditions attached to any public or private debt that South Africa undertakes, particularly if those conditions affect economic, social, and cultural rights? So my last slide then is just to say that really in recovering from the pandemic and in actually mobilizing resources towards us, we really need to think of how one can recommit to social expenditure and institutional capacity building to deliver economic, social, and cultural rights. I think the current environment of the pandemic has shown us how the erosion of public health systems and socio-economic rights left the world and South Africa ill prepared for the pandemic, and that in fact better investment in these critical public goods will serve as an invaluable tool to build resilience for future crises, and of course in the South African context to finally start showing some measurable progress to reducing the apartheid and colonial legacy. So thanks very much, Gladys, and I do apologize if I ran over time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Liebenberg. We appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much for contextualizing this discussion on economic, social, cultural rights and the impact of COVID-19 to communities. We thank you for the insightful presentation. And now call upon the next panelist, Yuri Ramkisson from South Africa Human Rights Commission. You're welcome, Yuri.
Thank you so much, Gladys, and greetings to all who are attending today. So my presentation is slightly different. It centers around addressing our responses to the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights mainly. The South African Human Rights Commission is a national human rights institution, or NHRI, which is mandated, or the mandate is stipulated under Chapter 9 of the South African Constitution. In relation to its international human rights instruments, the Paris principles indicate that an NHRI should encourage ratification, ensure domestication of international human rights instruments in national law, or at least harmonization, monitor the implementation of the provisions of the international instruments, and contribute to reports to the relevant UN committees. And the Human Rights Commission does this for many treaty bodies, including the ICSCR. I think the role of the Commission is much broader than that, but that's just, it in a nutshell. So the ICSCR was ratified in 2015, and this followed a lengthy ratification campaign by the CSO Ratification Coalition, led often by the Della Ome Institute. The SAHRC was part of this coalition, and other civil societies on their own also campaigned for this. The Human Rights Commission, I think, played an unprecedented role in coordinating engagements between the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, or DOJ, and in some cases, the state departments from which reports were required to the CSCR and civil society organizations. This process, I think, assisted the state greatly and enabled the depositing of the first country report to the KESA in time in 2017. But the SAHRC and civil society organizations reserved their right to submit parallel and shadow reports. And indeed, in October 2018, while the relevant state departments and Department of Justice were presenting their country report to KESA in Geneva, the Human Rights Commission had a closed session with the KESA, presenting the Commission's list of issues in response to the state's country report and general findings and recommendations on economic and social rights in South Africa. The presentation was well received, I think, both by KESA and the Department of Justice confirmed to this. Importantly, KESA asked the Commission to provide one concrete recommendation that the Commission believed that the state should adopt to take economic and social rights forward in the country as a whole. And the Commission proposed the development of a Human Development Index. It's also sometimes referred to Decent Standard Living Index or Adequate Standard of Living Index. And this recommendation was incorporated by KESA in its concluding observations and recommendations. Unfortunately, up until this point, we had a good relationship on this matter with the Department of Justice. Following the state's meeting with KESA, the commission found that things did start to fall apart a bit. Despite the onus being placed on the state to disseminate the concluding observations and recommendations, there was also a need to train the judiciary on the COBs and recommendations, and withdraw the declaration on the right to basic education, and there were other recommendations. The Department of Justice has since dropped the ball on this one. And in fact, the Commission took on the role of information disseminator, which it did via a seminar in November in 2019, which Professor Liebenberg attended and Gladys also presented at, and then a workshop in February 2020. The Commission also engaged directly with state departments at the latter event held in February 2020. And many of those departments had never seen the concluding observations and recommendations until we shared it with them prior to the meeting. And importantly, in recognition that the concluding observations cannot be achieved without adequate resources, the Commission invited National Treasury to attend the February workshop, and it did. Unfortunately, there are recommendations by the KESA that cannot be implemented by the Commission, and indeed, it's not the Commission's job to implement these anyway, such as the training of the judiciary and the development of a Human Development Index. Follow-ups with the Department of Justice have been mostly fruitless since the depositing of the country report in the meeting. And there's a lesson to be learned there, which I will speak about later. So to answer two of the questions that were set out by the organizers, I don't think that the specific recommendations from KESA have been implemented, save for those recommendations that were already planned for by the specific state departments, coincidentally since 2018. And there's been limited engagement with the State Department regarding this. Just a side note on the Human Development Index. Since 2018, the Human Rights Commission has been collaborating with the Australian National University in Canberra on an individual deprivation measure. It's the beginnings of a form of a Human Development Index. The university conducted the IDM study, Individual Deprivation Measure Study, in various countries, including South Africa. It included 334 enumeration areas, 3,517 dwellings or stands, 3,811 households, and 8,652 individuals. And the measure was done via survey. And I want to just share my screen now, so please tell me if you are able to see. Are you able to see these dimensions?
Yes, Yuri. Could you maybe expand it a little? Yes, right. That much better. Thank you.
Right. So the IDM asked questions along these 15 dimensions. There's a caveat around violence, but that's a story for another day. And you can see many of them are economic and social rights sorts of dimensions, but there's also importantly violence down here, time use, and so forth. And they rated the responses according to deprivation. So least deprived, somewhat deprived, deprived, and most deprived. And what was important about the study is that, well, firstly, this is an example of how the results were presented. So for example, in relation to education, questions were asked around two themes: education level and functional literacy and numeracy. And we can see that just over 50% of South Africans are least deprived, but almost 1/4 of South Africans are most deprived. So that would be an example. But in addition, the information can be disaggregated by various demographic information, so gender, race. In this case, it was disaggregated by rural, urban, so geographic location. And you can see in relation to access to drinking water, just under 50% of urban dwellers are least deprived, whereas just under 20% of rural dwellers are most deprived. And almost 40%, deprived. So it helps to disaggregate this information. If anyone wants to speak to me about this particular project, you're welcome to email me or call me. I will post the address, the website on the chat function, so you're able to access it. Okay, so I want to stop sharing now. I'm just trying to figure out, do you know how to do that?
Okay. Maybe help Yuri?
Okay.
If you can.
Is that
there
fine?
We go. Yes,
right.
Done.
Okay. All right. So so that is the potential of a Human Development Index. A similar study was done by the same company for people with disabilities, and it can be replicated in many settings. And then it has the potential for the development of a composite deprivation index for individuals, households, geographic areas, race groups, and so much more. It must be noted that during 2020, a most trying year, particularly regarding the advancement of human rights, the fault lines in economic and social rights were thrown into sharp relief, especially the lack of progressive realization of rights and how the state ticks a box and moves on and never goes back to a community to ensure that those rights are actually being realized. However, the Commission did find effective ways of mainstreaming the concluding observations and recommendations and used every opportunity possible just to push through the agenda for local complaints and issues, but tying these in with states' international obligations and the need for the state to respond systematically in a coordinated manner to international and domestic issues. So for example, under the national state of disaster in South Africa, the Commission developed engagement mechanisms with the Department of Water and Sanitation and the Department of Basic Education. So regular meetings and emails and so forth. We also sit on a housing task team with the Department of Human Settlements. The Commission used these platforms to remind the relevant departments of their obligations and to KESA. The Commission also worked with the Open Society Foundation on the, the development of international model law on housing. So there are ways in which you can, push through both the domestic requirements and international obligations, and tying them together really makes it very effective. So the lessons learned, I think, in moving forward, coming back to the point about the Department of Justice, we did really find that that to have a good point person in the relevant State Department is essential. So regarding the ICSCR process, we had a really responsive and passionate point person initially. And I think things fell apart when she took up a post in another department. And efforts to engage the Department of Justice since then have all but failed. And I actually really can't tell you, as the national NHRI in South Africa, I can't tell you what the status is of the 24-month report that should have been deposited in November 2020. I haven't got a response. And I mean, the Commission will obviously keep escalating this matter. It will now probably have to go to the Minister of DOJ. But I don't even know if there was an extension applied for. Sandy Liebenberg has, said that they probably did, but I can't tell you for certain. So I think a good point person is essential, and I think we're going to have to work very hard to get a good point person back in relation to this process. A collaborative process between the State Department, civil society, and Chapter 9 organizations is also always beneficial, as long as Chapter 9 organizations and civil society reserve their right to draft their own shadow and parallel reports. Then mainstreaming concluding observations and recommendations is a very effective way of couching economic and social rights issues. And it makes state departments take local complaints more seriously, as sad as that may seem, because as Sandy Liebenberg pointed out, the ICSCR is not cast in stone. Our constitution is, but sometimes it takes international agreements to make state departments realize what their local commitments are. The Commission will continue to engage with the state, but I think that the role of civil society can never be overstated. Its ability to hold the state to account in realization to the ICSCR deliverables and the implementation of the concluding observations and recommendations. This is essential and must continue. And the Commission will support civil society in any way necessary. The Commission will also continue with its Section 184.3 mandate, which is to monitor the realization of economic and social rights. And this year in particular, we will focus on the state's response in relation to ESR under COVID-19 or the pandemic. Events such as these that Dullah Omar Institute has organized, I think it's invaluable to gather our findings, gather our thoughts and strategies, and coordinate on the way forward so we're not replicating or duplicating. And then just to answer one more question in relation to what other countries are doing, note that there are several examples of the implementation of socioeconomic rights internationally. This is particularly in Europe, Canada, and India. However, these countries rely on legislation and policy making. This is voluntary state commitments and action, and then complaints and litigation. And, this has largely not been that effective in South Africa. We seem to fail when we rely on the goodwill of government. There's very few creative methods of implementation and monitoring, such as community-based monitoring, local government transparency, community ownership of projects, and so forth. And I think these are sorely needed in a country like South Africa. We really need creative ways of ensuring implementation and ensuring engagement with communities and their participation. Because South Africa has beautiful law, but we have poor implementation and we have staggering levels of poverty and inequality. yeah, so that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you for that presentation. Thank you for contextualizing the central role of South Africa Human Rights Commission that has played in South Africa's ratification of the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, as well as the documenting, monitoring, and tracking of progress of socio-economic rights at the national level. Thank you for that, Yuri. Really appreciate it. And now I'll call upon Lynette Matt from Black Sash. Welcome, Lynette.
Okay, thank you very much, Gladys. I am going to put my video on mute because I have an unstable line, so just bear with me. Thank you very, very much. So
please go ahead.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Right, okay. So let us just take this opportunity to thank the Dullah Omar Institute for the invitation, and thank you, Sandy, for setting the context so well. The Black Sash is a member of the ICSCR coalition coordinated by the Dullah Omar Institute. We've contributed to shadow reports, all sorts of reports, attended meetings with government departments, and I concur with Yuri of what Yuri said about the implementation. What we have done, and I mean, in one of these meetings with government in Pretoria, DSD, for example, knew about these recommendations, but they were still putting forward old solutions, and nobody had really given much thought about what needs to happen going forward. So what I've decided to do in this presentation is to take a dive into social security and the recommendations, or some of the recommendations, because that's the work of the Black Sash, and it's the work of civil society organizations that work with us. So this presentation will focus specifically on that, so that we just get one deep dive into one of the areas. So if one look at what Sandy said earlier on, the recommendations from the UN committee, there were 5 areas, and those had to do with inadequate standards. It had to do with income support for 18 to 59. It had to do with coverage for the unemployment insurance fund benefits that are low, but it also excluded workers in the informal economy, seasonal workers, and self-employed people. It also made the observation about data and bank accounts belonging to social grant recipients that are misused, and also the unauthorized deductions. And the Black Sash, with various civil society organizations, ran a campaign around the Hands of Our Grants that focus specifically on that. So the recommendations being made forward, apart from raising the adequate standard, was to ensure that those between 18 to 59 years with no or little income have access to social assistance. And the report also said that recommendation needed to be reported on by the end of October 2020. The deadline was in November. There was an issue of expanding coverage. I know that some of the coverage in the unemployment fund, it was extended, but the extent to which people have access to that, particularly domestic workers, farm laborers, those who are precariously employed or in casual employment during the COVID condition, was a struggle. And then there was this recommendation about consider the possibility of introducing a universal basic income grant and address the situation around the outsourcing of payments. I want to take the 2 issues, or maybe the 1 issue that relates to income support for 18 to 59. So with us going in lockdown level 5 in March to contain the coronavirus, that brought with it a humanitarian and economic crisis. Government responded with a 50 billion rand package, and 50 billion of that was given to the Department of Social Development and SASSA to do three things. The first one is to top up all grants. However, the child support grant only received that for 1 month. The introduction of the COVID social relief of distress grant to the value of 350 Rand from May to October 31 last year. The introduction of the COVID relief of distress grants for caregivers to the value of 500 Rand for the period of 5 months from June to October. And by September, October last year, government has contributed just over 40 billion Rand to that package. So it didn't raise the entire amount. That was in the medium-term expenditure framework. So the introduction of these measures took us closer towards social assistance or basic income support for those aged 18 to 59, although it was under conditions of disaster. And what it, I think, allowed the state to do was that there was an online system put in place for people to register. SASSA has a database of those who are currently unemployed. It's sitting at 9 million. It also has a database of caregivers at about 7.1 million. There are approximately 6 million people who receive the grant on a regular basis. And we will shortly have research studies on the impact of the COVID grant that will give us further pointers for how that system can be improved or what needs to be taken out or whatever. But it's about the impact of the grant, so we can also see what's happening there already. But there was a range of challenges to the implementation of the system. One was that it was piloting simultaneously as implementing. And so there was a lot of errors, and as you go along, the design process happened. So nobody had thought about cash payments, etc., etc. The entirely online system had particular challenges, access challenges. So those with no devices, in other words, smartphones, data interconnectivity, were unable to access it. There was also a challenge with the toll-free line, and there continues to be challenges with those. The issue of the outdated, I mean, some of the people have also told us that they were charged by others with smartphones to the value of 150 Rand to actually access that device. So the impact of technology on a system is something that we really need to think through a bit more carefully. Outdated SARS databases, UIF, NASFAS, which excluded people needing this most vital income. The system of monthly verification, you can have 50 Rand from your sister or whatever, and that 50 Rand will exclude you from getting a 350 Rand grant if it's paid into a bank account. So there's other challenges included. The late introductions of appeal process and the problematic implementation. There's a backlog of that. The bank account versus cash, and some people wanted cash, but there was also no communication system. So it ended up that SAPO had extremely long queues. Many had to pay bank fees and additional transport to get their money. There was also, I mean, there's a big exclusion issue. Around 3 million people of the 9 million applicants. And the reasons for those exclusions still needs to be interrogated a little bit more in detail. The exclusion of refugees, asylum seekers, and those with special permits. The Scalabrini won their court case on that matter. And while the system is being developed, it's been slow in going. So by December, not many of the people who are due to receive the grant have actually received it, and it's just something that we are keeping our hand on. But we have been in contact with SASSA on a regular basis through the recourse forum to actually give feedback on the system, and then also write the necessary letters or make the necessary submissions where we think the system needs particular beefing up, like the appeals. So the pressure from civil society organizations and academia resulted in the president announcing in October an extension of the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant of 350 Rand. However, the COVID SRD caregiver grant were not extended, and the majority of women benefited from that provision. And there's also a problem in terms of women are not given the grant in their own right. They're now given the child support grant, and hopefully the child support grant must support an entire household, often of up to between 6 and 10 people. We've tried an urgent court application to extend the grant, but it was struck off the roll due to procedural defect. And it's something that we're still thinking through of how do we need to go forward on that particular issue. So civil society galvanized quite a lot of support. I mean, at the beginning, when the president announced this thing in May, these measures in May, we wrote and asked that these provisions be turned into a permanent social assistance grant for adults between the ages of 18 to 59. And this later was supported by approximately 7 organizations. Various reports were tabled, including the Black Sash launching its basic income support grant. It's available on our website. There were research studies, reports, seminars, workshops. A range of civil society organizations create a mosaic of activity to kind of push and discuss and debate this, including the ANC's social development committee. There was lots of media engagement to get weight behind basic income support. The Black Sash also launched a petition. It's still ongoing. There's about just under 300,000 signatures to that petition. And together with other groups like the Cash Transfers and COPAC and others, we have engaged in advocacy activities to ensure that this issue keeps on the fire. Also in December last year, the DSD, in fact in November, the DSD launched a discussion paper on the basic income grant. And they hosted several consultation meetings, 2 separate meetings, one with civil society and one with research organizations. We held preparatory meetings amongst ourselves, etc. But we also made with others a submission to DSD on that peak. And the 2 issues that were missing, apart from the broader framework, was the implementation framework and the financial model were missing from those. The National Planning Commission also hosted a webinar titled Social Protection and Pathways to Basic Income Grant. And Professor Taylor made a presentation which is also available. It talks about how the process needs to be phased in. We made submissions on those. So whilst we haven't received the government's report to the United Nations, there has been a lot of activity in order to kind of place this issue on the agenda and keep this issue on the agenda. It's a continuous battle, and now we are at a point where government has extended the COVID social leave of distress grant, but it's about to end on the 31st of January. And there's again, we wrote in the week to the president to ask for a meeting. We are, I think we've received a letter referring us to the Department of Social Development. So hopefully there will be some engagement there. But just on government and concurring with Sandy, government is making this a financial issue, not a human rights issue. And it's based on economic policies that includes austerity. So we will continue to call on government to extend these grants and to ultimately get us to a permanent social assistance regime for 18 to 59 years. And ultimately that it be pegged at the upper bound poverty line. For now, we're saying maybe the food poverty line is where we need to target, because 350 is just too little. So there isn't an appreciation yet for the progressive realization of the right, but civil society must hold the state accountable for the right to social security and other rights. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you for that very incisive presentation on the implementation of COVID-19 social relief grant. I must commend Black Sash and yourselves for the brilliant advocacy work on this issue. Keep up the good work.
We're not
and on
alone.
that note, and your partners. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you for that. I'd like to encourage everyone to kindly use the chat function for the question and answer session. We're running slightly out of time, and I'd like now to call upon Bruce Porter. Hopefully he has joined us. It's very early in the morning in Canada. Bruce Porter, are you here?
Yes, I can see him.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi Gladys, thanks very much. And sorry to be joining late. My Zoom calendar told me it was 8 a.m. that it started in Canada, so I had my time mixed up. Unfortunately, I missed all the other speakers, which I'm really regretting. I'm going to try to quickly talk about just a couple of issues in Canada, and I thought I would try to share my screen if that's okay, and do a PowerPoint if I can access it.
Please go ahead. You could share your screen.
Are you able to see my PowerPoint now?
Yes. I think you need to double click somewhere in the bottom, at the bottom, to make it full screen.
Is it going to work just with the smaller one, or can people not see it?
And we can see it, it's just smaller, but anyway, just go ahead. We'll try and figure out the mechanism. Please go ahead.
Sorry about that. Just really quickly, I wanted to talk about two issues as kind of case studies of how we've used international human rights mechanisms in Canada. The first is to address the issue of homelessness in Canada, which of course is a really egregious violation in a cold climate like ours. The photograph, if you can see it, is of people who are homeless living in actually this is Fredericton, New Brunswick, but in every city in Canada in the winter and the cold, you see people on the streets living alone or in tents. And for years, we've advocated for action on that at the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and in other treaty bodies. One of the things that we focused on, I wanted to look at the way in which we try to combine advocacy at the UN with advocacy for effective remedies and within domestic law, which is a huge challenge in Canada, where we don't have economic, social and cultural rights explicitly enumerated in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but where the right to life and security of the person and equality can easily be interpreted to provide effective remedies for violations like homelessness, which clearly it kills people every week in Canada in this environment. So a lot of our advocacy is working with the concept of interdependence of social and economic rights and civil and political rights. And we've engaged with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, particularly around these issues of how courts interpret rights in Canada so as to either deny or provide effective remedies for violations like homelessness. So you'll remember that one of the key obligations under international human rights law is to implement a strategy to realize the right to housing. It's not good enough just to stop evictions or anything. We have to have goals and timelines for the complete elimination of homelessness and the realization of the right to housing. This is very clear in General Comment number 3, and then throughout the commentary from the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the obligation of progressive realization, which of course you have in the South African Constitution. is something that also requires a plan to move towards the full realization. And this is really the toughest area of social and economic rights to get access to justice on in order to hold governments accountable to actually move towards the full realization. So that's been the focus of the advocacy on homelessness in Canada, really for probably 25, 30 years before the committee. And the other issue that I wanted to focus on was access to healthcare for irregular migrants. This is a photograph of Nell Toussaint, who is the claimant in a case that we eventually took to the UN Human Rights Committee under the optional protocol. And again, arguing that the right to life should be interpreted in order to ensure access to healthcare where it's necessary for the protection of life. Just a tiny bit of history. This is the front page of the first ever submission made to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights by an NGO during a periodic review. And I've entitled it Securing Space for Rights Claimants at the CESCR in the 1990s. So the history is that prior to the 1990s, economic, social and cultural rights were really seen in a quite elitist fashion as being a dialogue between governments and experts with really no place at all for rights claimants. So it was in 1993 that we petitioned the committee with the new chairperson, Philip Alston, and said, how can you review Canada's compliance with social and economic rights if you don't hear from people who've been affected by the violations in Canada? So we the committee adopted this new procedure, which was actually quite unheard of at the UN, to actually hear from rights claimants and NGOs in the process of periodic reviews. And it was subsequently adopted by other treaty bodies, but it made quite a splash in Canada, and really was the beginning of a lot of mobilization in Canada around using treaty bodies to try to advocate for, particularly for social and economic rights, which are so neglected in the context of Canadian access to justice. And this is just a photograph of me from 1993 on the right with the director of the National Anti-Poverty Organization, and then in 2016 with the director of the National Anti-Poverty Organization, I guess quite a few years later, a less baggy suit, if you can see the photograph. Can you actually see these things? Anyway, hopefully you can.
It's small. We can see it, but it's pretty small. Maybe you could double click on the slide itself and see if it expands.
Yeah, I think it has to do with
right there at the top.
Experts. Can you see where my cursor is? Is there something I'm supposed to? I think I'm supposed to click on something at the top.
Yeah.
Slideshow.
Yeah.
Can we try slideshow?
Slideshow. Yeah. Where is? Oh.
And then from current slide, it's right there on top.
Oh, right.
Next to animation, slideshow. From
Right.
current slide. Right here on the left again.
Yay! Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the key principle that we use in terms of getting access to effective remedies is the principle in a dualist country like Canada, where where international human rights isn't directly enforceable, but the obligation is to interpret domestic law in accordance with international human rights law. And the Supreme Court has said that the Canadian Charter in particular should generally be presumed to provide protection, at least as great as that is afforded by provisions in international human rights documents. So the whole principle is to get the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and other treaty bodies to say what is required of international human rights law, and then we can go to court and argue that that same obligation should be found under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so we've actually engaged the committee in reviewing judicial decision-making and suggesting that courts have, in some cases, treated social and economic rights as mere policy objectives rather than as fundamental human rights, and criticizing courts for the way in which they have failed to provide effective remedies. It's quite an unusual element, and we've been encouraging the committee to engage more actively in dialogue directly with the judicial branch, which does share the state parties' obligations under all treaties, and where we depend so much on judicial interpretation. It's critical that committees actually engage independently to some extent with the courts in countries that may be denying effective remedies. So again, we've had statements over the course of a number of concluding observations in 93, 1998, 2006, 2016, growing concern alarm from the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights about Canada's failure to address the growing problem of homelessness and to provide effective remedies. And one of the key issues that we focused on was the obligation to develop a national strategy to eliminate homelessness and to realize the right to housing. Canada had no national housing strategy. But in the context of engaging with the government around homelessness, Sandy may have described the process around the list of issues that the committee develops, which is sent to the government, and the government then has to reply to the list of issues. So we made sure that the committee was asking Canada about access to justice for homelessness and whether the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which protects the right to security of the person and the right to life, shouldn't be interpreted to protect from homelessness and to ensure access to adequate housing. So Canada had responded to those questions in 2 periodic reviews by saying, yes, Section 7 of the Charter does cover security of the person, and the Supreme Court of Canada has said that it can be interpreted to provide access to basic necessities such as housing. And so this case of Victoria v. Adams was the first one in which a court was actually called upon to decide whether the Charter should be interpreted in that manner. And it was able to cite what Canada had told the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was quite different from what the government of British Columbia in that case was arguing before the court. So it just shows that these dialogues at the international level can actually be used in domestic courts to say, well, you told the UN committee that the Charter protects access to housing. Now you're telling us that it doesn't. What's the true situation? And then the other point that we really tried to focus on was the obligation of progressive realization, which was really the key issue was to implement a national strategy for the reduction of homelessness that includes measurable goals and timetables, consultation and collaboration with affected communities, a complaints procedure so that you have some kind of really participatory access to justice in the context of the obligation of progressive realization, and transparent accountability mechanisms in keeping with covenant standards. We then got the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing when he did a mission to Canada in 2007 to say basically exactly the same thing. You've got to have a national housing strategy with complaints procedures and goals and timelines, etc. So we then went to court in a case called Tannen-Georgia v. Canada, and essentially argued that what the committee had told Canada that it had to do to eliminate homelessness, and Canada had failed to do, that failure to implement a strategy violated the rights under the Charter to life and security of the person and equality. So that was actually I think it's an important strategy. We lost in a 2-to-1 decision at the Court of Appeal, but it's an issue that as you'll hear later when I talk about the Toussaint case, we're still moving forward on the idea that when UN treaty bodies say that Canada should do something, that the decision not to do it is a reviewable decision. And if by not implementing a housing strategy, the result is that people die on the streets, then that's really something that should be a violation of the Charter. So by looking at what treaty bodies say has to be done, you then have decisions about whether or not those obligations are implemented, which can be challenged. So the Court of Appeal dismissed that claim, but in the result of, and we then had special rapporteurs criticize Canada for not having implemented the strategy and criticizing the arguments that the federal government had been making at the Court of Appeal about the fact that it doesn't have an obligation to implement a strategy under the Canadian Charter. So once again, this whole sort of dialectic between what Canada is obliged to do under international law and what it's obliged to do under domestic law and trying to remedy that gap. The response to the Tannen-Georgia decision then was political. They said, okay, the court's not going to order the government to do it. So we mobilized to try to ensure that the government would implement the obligation that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights had said is a clear obligation under international law. So there was a lot of mobilization. And finally, in 2019, we got the National Housing Strategy Act, which declares that housing is a right. It's the first time an international right, social and economic rights has been actually declared to be a fundamental right in Canadian legislation. It requires the minister to implement a strategy that is consistent with the progressive realization of the right to housing under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So you see that what's unusual for us in this legislation is that rather than referencing rights under the Canadian Charter, It directly references the rights under the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and suggests that there are, and then puts in place mechanisms to hold the government accountable to that obligation of progressive realization. So even though we still can challenge lots of other things in court, the obligation of progressive realization is one that we haven't had much luck, and that's true in a lot of countries, in terms of actually imposing, getting the courts to engage with that obligation to move forward towards the full realization of the right. And so this legislation puts in place a different kind of mechanism. Rather than relying on courts, we have a federal housing advocate who receives submissions from rights holders and affected organizations, makes findings and recommendations on systemic issues, which then go to the minister, and the minister has to respond within a period of time. And then there's a panel that's made up of human rights experts with people with lived experience of homelessness who are able to hold hearings into major systemic issues. Again, giving an opinion and obligations that are to take measures which the minister must respond to. And these are tabled in both the House of Commons and in the Senate. So rather than relying on courts, we have this alternative mechanism. All this is brand new for us and is just being implemented. But what I wanted to emphasize is how it came out of years and years of advocacy with the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, reinforced by the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, where we use both the mission to Canada, and then there's a communications procedure to Special Rapporteurs, which we use to raise the problem of the fact that Canada hadn't implemented these obligations. It's a long, long struggle, particularly in Canada, where there's so much hostility to social and economic rights, but ultimately this was hopefully a success story because we got our legislation and we're just putting in place these mechanisms. So the other issue I wanted to look at was the Toussaint case, in which an example of using an optional protocol with a complaints procedure. So Canada, like South Africa, has not ratified the optional protocol to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is a terrible failure, excuse me, which I'm sure Sandy has talked about, but in terms of how important that is. But the optional complaints procedures under treaty bodies, and South Africa has ratified others like the optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is what we used in the Toussaint case. And so there's just a number of huge benefits to that, which is that it provides a human face to these complaints so that it's no longer just a kind of abstract debate about policy. It provides access to justice for stigmatized individuals who may not be supported by strong advocacy organizations, which is the case with irregular migrants in Canada. We have a strong advocacy community for refugees and asylum seekers, but we don't have a strong advocacy community for irregular migrants, unfortunately. And so Nell Toussaint, as an individual, was able to create major systemic change, certainly internationally, even though she didn't have a lot of support from organizations here. And then in Canada, it provides us with access to justice in a different paradigm of human rights, which is clearly recognizes the positive obligations of states to implement legislation, to take positive measures. We tend to be still stuck in negative rights, kinds of freedom from eviction, but not an obligation to provide housing in terms of the way Canadian courts have approached rights. So the international system allows us to get access to a different paradigm. And it challenges miscarriages of justice that have occurred within Canadian courts. You have to have exhausted effective domestic remedies in order to have access to the optional complaints procedure. So you're really always going to be challenging some kind of failure in the domestic judicial system. So I'm going to skip the stuff on the optional protocol, but just to point out that South Africa, like in Canada, you do have access to the optional protocols to the ICCPR, and the Human Rights Committee has made major strides forward in its General Comment 36 in recognizing the interdependence of economic, social, and cultural rights with the right to life in Article 6 of the ICCPR. And this is what we used in the Toussaint case. So in the Toussaint case, Nell Toussaint was denied access to health care. Her life was put at risk. The courts, in fact, found that her right to life had been violated by the refusal of health care, but found that it was justified because it was in service of promoting compliance with Canada's Canada's immigration laws. And so you get this very authoritative, impressive decision. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights under Sandy's leadership has released incredibly authoritative decisions that read much better than a lot of the decisions we get from domestic courts. And that's so important that when you take these to court, they actually read authoritatively. And then the human dimension is so critical because Nell Toussaint has been known she's an incredible person, and with stigma attached to irregular migrants, it's been so critical to be able to kind of work with Nell to bring this issue forward. And then the option protocol using the essentially, Nell Toussaint was denied access to healthcare under the domestic law, based on a really horrific state of the law in Canada, which found in one case called Shauli at the Supreme Court of Canada that interfering with rich people's access to private healthcare insurance violated their right to life, because obviously healthcare is associated with the right to life. But in subsequent cases, the courts have found that if it's access to public healthcare that people need in order to protect their lives, well, that's the right to health, and the right to health is a social and economic right, and that's not contained in our charter. So you have the protection of the right to life of people who are rich, but not of people who rely on public healthcare. That has to be changed. And having access to international human rights treaty bodies allows us to challenge these systemic failures of the justice system in Canada. And then this was a miscarriage of justice at another level as well. We provided expert evidence that was uncontested, that it's a complete negative, a false stereotype that irregular migrants migrate in search of free services like healthcare or housing. It's called the healthy migrant syndrome, and as you will know, people migrate for work, and they work as undocumented workers, and then subsequently may become ill and need access to healthcare. But despite that expert evidence from a leading international authority, with no evidence on the other side, Federal Court of Appeal felt entitled to just create this whole scare scenario that if Canada were to provide access to healthcare, people would be jumping into boats from across the sea to sail to Canada in search of free healthcare, and maybe the boats would sink and they would perish at sea. Just absolutely unbelievable of non-evidence-based decision-making. So when you've had failures of the domestic courts of that way, getting access to the petition procedure is really an incredible opportunity to get a fairer and more reasoned decision. And so the Committee on the Human Rights Committee released a decision 2 years ago, which found that Canada had violated the right to life under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that the phony justifications that were provided were not valid under international law. And so Canada had violated Nell Toussaint's right to life and non-discrimination, and Canada is obliged to take all steps necessary to prevent similar violations. In other words, change the law. Canada's response was typical of a growing kind of arrogance we have in Canada that said, well, we interpret the Civil and Political Rights Covenant differently, and we're unable to agree with the views of the committee. We're not going to take measures to implement it. So this is just outrageous. So this is the issue that we're facing in a lot of countries now, where you have all of these great procedures internationally, and then countries are just not implementing the decisions, not implementing the recommendations. So we're going to court basically to challenge Canada's decision not to implement the views of the committee. So even though they're not binding under Canadian law, there are ways of, what we're arguing is that, first of all, now that the committee has said that Canada has violated the right to life, that is something that should be considered in interpreting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It should be interpreted differently than the Federal Court of Appeal interpreted it, because a key principle is that it has to be interpreted to provide protection at least as great as is afforded by international human rights law. So we're asking the court to revisit the question of whether Nell Toussaint's right to life and non-discrimination under the Canadian Charter was violated. Otherwise, and the federal government is now moving to dismiss this case, saying, no, that decision is final. But if that decision is final, how is it that domestic courts are meeting their obligations to ensure that the international rule of law and that Canadian law is in compliance, and that the interpretations of Canadian law are in accordance with Canada's international human rights obligations? And the alternative argument we're making is that even if they won't go back and revisit that earlier issue, they should at least be reviewing Canada's decision to not implement the views. Is that decision, in fact, resulting in violations of the right to life and non-discrimination of irregular migrants? Is it not a violation of the Charter properly interpreted in light of the committee's views? Or is it a reasonable decision? Because we've got jurisprudence from the Supreme Court that reasonable decision-making has to be informed by Canada's international human rights obligations. So when they decide not to implement concluding observations or in particular views from decisions from treaty bodies, that should be subject to reasonableness review based on international human rights obligations. So that's where we are. And the government has said that they're going to, yeah, I'm just finishing up now. So the government is moving to dismiss it, and we will continue to fight that for the position that there has to be effective remedies within domestic law for these identified violations of international human rights law. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bruce. Sorry for interrupting you. I just wanted to let you know that we're running out of time. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's okay. Thank you for your insightful presentation on how dialogues at an international level can be used as an advocacy strategy at the national level to enable participatory justice. And thank you so much for also highlighting the benefits of ratifying the optional protocol. We appreciate your presentation. Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I had requested that everyone send the questions, use the chat function for the questions to respective presenters. However, in the interest of time, may I suggest that we continue maybe this discussion via email, and I just want to allow each presenter a 2-minute sort of to respond to the questions that they've received on the chat function, but also their concluding remarks. We'll start with Professor Liebenberg, please.
Okay, Sandy, yes, thanks very much, everyone. And yes, just to echo what Bruce said, I mean, I think, you know, the 2 points that I really got from his presentation was, you know, the creative remedies, so the housing rights advocate and the involvement of people who are experiencing homelessness. You know, I think there is such creative work that can be done. And then just to say the optional protocol should also be a critical part of implementation. I'm sorry I didn't have time to address that in my presentation, but the idea that, you know, you have a right to a remedy at an international level, and that should certainly be part of the strategy. And then, Gladys, there were just a number of questions on migrants and refugees and so forth. I mean, just to say that the point of departure of both the South African Constitution and the International Covenant is that these are universal human rights, and that they are, you know, that so-called non-nationals are entitled to these rights, and there are limited exceptions made for developing countries with regard to the right to work, economic rights, and I've posted the committee's statement of doctrine on this issue. But at least as far as access to basic healthcare services, education, and social security, I mean, the point of departure is that, you know, there should be universal access. So I just wanted to touch on that issue, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks, Gladys.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you for being for giving the insightful response. May I invite Yuri? Yuri, are you with us?
I am, thanks. So I don't think there were any questions specifically to me. Just to note that the Commission, along with civil society, will keep pushing for the ratification of the optional protocol. In terms of the basic income grant, civil society is doing a lot of work in relation to this. And I did see a Daily Maverick article. I can't seem to pick it up now, but according to the Daily Maverick, ANC policymakers have endorsed the basic income grant. I think at the moment it's far from implementation because between the costs of vaccines and the lack of growth, as they say, in this country, there isn't money for it at the moment. But I think that's something we're going to have to work our way around because there seems to be money for a lot of other things. And the basic income grant is essential. So I think that's some work we will be taking forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you for that response. Lynette?
Just from my side, I think that advocacy can do a lot to make people think differently about where the resources need to be put, and particularly with the basic income grant. That's an important issue that we will continue to pursue. But there's also the link to the progressive realization, and from the Canadian and from what Sandy was saying, it is an area that we need to really check and explore. And I'm also interested going forward in looking at how best we can use the international instruments to ensure local domestication and implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. Bruce Potter?
Yeah, I guess I would just emphasize that so many of us in different countries are facing this challenge of economic, social, cultural rights, tending to still focus on negative rights violations like evictions, which are critical and horrific, but we also have to hold governments accountable to progressive realization and redistribution and so on, particularly now. And we do rely so much on Sandy's excellent work on sort of transformational constitutionalism, but international human rights are essentially transformational, and governments are not doing what they need to do to move forward towards the realization of rights. So I think that's on our collective global agenda for the next decade, and particularly as we emerge from the pandemic. And I think it's a challenge that we're all working together on, and we take a lot of benefit from what is being done in South Africa around progressive realization, but obviously there's a lot more that needs to be done. So thank you very much for the chance to connect with all of you on this.
Thank you, Bruce, for that. Really appreciate it. I will now call upon Professor Duro Jayet to say something as we conclude the webinar. Ebenezer, over to you. Ebenezer, maybe he can't hear us. Is there someone with the burning questions? Just we have time for 5 minutes. A question from someone? Anyone? The participant?
Can I just say hello and hi to everybody and to Sandy?
Justice Sachs, please go ahead.
No, I just want to smile and say hello and to occupy one of the 5 minutes with congratulations to the team and to the Institute. I'm finished.
Thank you very much for your compliment. Sandy?
Sorry, I was just waving at Aldi. I didn't really have something to say. I mean, I'm conscious that we didn't sort of answer Chantel's question about the policing issue. you know, and all the abuses that have taken place during the lockdown, where even the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights said that South Africa's lockdown culture was toxic, you know, and we've had so many brutal sort of incidents, you know, so I think this is obviously, it speaks to what many of the other speakers were saying about the interdependence of rights, you know, also because, you know, if people can't organize and people are not treated with dignity and respect, that also affects their economic, social and cultural rights. So I don't have anything very big to say on that, but just to say that I agree with Chantal about this being a very critical issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. I think with those few remarks, we come to the end of this webinar. I want to thank everyone who participated, especially the panelists as well as the participants, for the insightful discussion and food for thought as we continue. I want to also thank the organizers of this webinar. This is the first of a few in a series, and we hope that you'll all be able to participate in the upcoming ones. We really appreciate your time. And with those few remarks, I want to say goodbye and good afternoon to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.